implications of the world we're facing right now.
Okay, thank you, Sensei Jim. I'm going to share screen, and then I think Sensei Jim, can I mute everybody for the time being? You don't have to self-mute. I guess I'll try mute. Rob, can you try that? If you mute everybody except me and Sensei Jim. And I'm going to shoot a screen share right now.
Okay, I think I can do it.
Okay.
I did some of them.
Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen share. I can't see you except for Jim Sensei. Are we okay with this, Sensei?
Yes, it looks good.
Great. Well, I think we'll start if it's not too much trouble with everybody. I mentioned earlier, my name is Bill Stevens. I'm an attorney and I'm head instructor at the Boston Judo Club in Massachusetts. I appreciate the opportunity to speak briefly with you today about what common sense things instructors and coaches can do to keep everyone safe and avoid unnecessary and unwarranted legal action. It's not a very long presentation. I'd be glad to answer any questions following the presentation, but I think it'd be best for me to go through this before answering your questions or listening to your comments. Like I said, it should take only about 20 or 25 minutes. It's my contact information there. Feel free to email me at any time. I'm happy to discuss anything with you. Celtics, Tom Brady down in Tampa Bay, judo, anything. But basically, knowledge of a judo instructor's responsibilities. And I interchange instructor and coach because they're two in the same. There are two purposes. First, it provides a strong stimulus to keep everything safe. Second, if instructors use every precaution to prevent injuries, they're in a good position to defend themselves against litigation. Now, the early birds, the people who are here now, the next two slides I'll go over some definitions on negligence. And if you happen to fall asleep or start texting your friends after these two slides, that's okay, because this is the core of the presentation. It's negligence, okay? Negligence is the failure to exercise reasonable care. I emphasize reasonable care, not extraordinary care, in a situation that causes harm to someone. The prominent test of negligence is foreseeability, whether the judo instructor should have been able to foresee the danger of harm to the student. And that's it. Now, there are four elements of liability and negligence. First is the duty of the instructor's duty in general is to protect against unreasonable risks of injury. The basic question in every negligence case is whether the defendant acted as a reasonable person would have in similar circumstances. The reasonable person. Second, was this duty breached? The breach can be the instructor's careless performance or lack of performance of care when one fails to fulfill the duty of care to act reasonably. Third, did this carelessness cause the damage or injury? Was there a reasonable proximate causal link between the breach of duty and the injury? And fourth, damage or damages. To what extent was the instructor at fault, or to what extent was the student at fault? What is the damage amount and how you measure it? Next, I want to talk about the reasonable man. I took this slide from Comerford Sensei. He is the reasonable man, okay? The reasonable person, okay, the reasonable man theory refers to a test, legal test, whereby a hypothetical person is used as a legal standard, especially to determine if someone acted with negligence. Thus, the standard for a reasonable judo instructor would be one of average care, skills, conduct, and judgment for a judo instructor, not for a PhD candidate, not for a lawyer, not for a doctor, average standard of care for a judo instructor. That's the framework of the reasonable man. Okay, list of common defenses against negligence. This is the, in order to prove negligence, the plaintiff has to prove all four of these elements. If the plaintiff cannot prove any of these four elements, the negligent claim fails. So assumption of risk, we'll talk about that a bit later, but people who know, understand, and appreciate the danger involved in an activity and voluntarily engage in it willingly expose themselves to certain predictable inherent risks, okay? Assumption of risk applies only to risks inherent in the sport, like in judo. And the athlete must know, understand, and appreciate the risk being voluntarily incurred. And the athlete does not assume any risks due to negligence on part of the coach. Now, there are two menus for negligence, okay? Contributory negligence and comparative negligence. Contributory negligence is less common in jurisdictions. Every state has a standard for measuring the negligence. In contributive negligence, if an athlete contributes in any way to his or her injury, it's considered contributory negligence. The plaintiff athlete's denied recovery because of his or her own conduct disentitles him or her to maintain the action, even though the coach may have breached his duty or has been negligent and would otherwise be liable. As I mentioned, consult your attorney. This is not a common negligence, a form of negligence recovery in most states. Most states adhere to the comparative negligence standard. Excuse me. Generally, the athlete cannot recover if his or her fault contributes 50% or more to the accident. In some states, the player can recover any percentage of fault by the defendant. Again, this varies in different jurisdictions. Governmental immunity, the common law theory that the state and agencies are sovereign. They cannot be sued without their consent and should not be held liable for the negligence of their employees. However, a lot of states have statutes limiting this liability. And an act of God is basically something out of your control. That really forces behind the control where man can cause an injury. And that's it. Okay, now we're going to go into the legal duties of instructors. It's all pretty much common sense. But what duties instructors and coach should follow prevent unnecessary harm to your students? As we'll discuss, there are three factors that give liability: failure to instruct, failure to warn, and failure to supervise. So next I'm going to talk about supervision. There are two types of supervision: general supervision, as in this frame here, and specific supervision. Supervision in the context of martial arts like judo is defined as overseeing the activities of the program. This includes recognizing potential hazards, implementing risk management measures, and monitoring for compliance. Those three elements of general supervision. Next, we get into specific supervision. Teaching of an activity. I'm sure all the teachers have to be certified, don't have to be certified, qualified supervisor has adequate education to perform the task. Specific supervision is constant and continuous supervision appropriate for individuals or small groups receiving instruction involved in high-risk activities like judo or using areas that have the potential for serious injury. The more dangerous the activity, the more specific supervision is required. I'll give you a few examples of specific supervision. CPR, we talked about knowledge of the sport. Instructor can perform the skills of the sport, teach the skills, be knowledgeable of sport physiology and counseling. We'll talk about warning later on and present clear warning of the inherent risks within the activity. An instructor or coach should evaluate participants for injury and incapacity and able to match and equate participants properly for that activity. I'm pretty sure all judo organizations that are part of USA Judo and other organizations require periodic safe sport certifications, criminal background checks, CPR and first aid certifications, and concussion training. I want to point out that many states require an automated external defibrillator, AED device, to be available at the training site, and that some person be qualified to use the AED. So please keep that in mind about your AED. Okay, maintaining a safe environment. Trip and fall, that's one of the biggest sources of litigation. It's apparatus. So the dojo owner owes its students a duty to keep the premises in a reasonably safe condition and warn invitees of dangers that may not be reasonably discovered. Although a plaintiff to successfully assert liability and recover dangers, the plaintiff has to prove that the dojo owner either, and we're going to talk about this next, had actual notice of the presence of the specific unsafe condition which caused the injury, or constructive notice. Let's talk about actual notice, okay, with equipment. It's always best to notify a responsible person of a problem with equipment, or, as many of us know, even sometimes personnel, to a person in authority in writing, with a copy on file, and a verbal follow-up to confirm receipt of the written notice. If one gives oral notice of an issue, it's good practice to have another adult present to verify the notice of the problem. So this is actual notice. Constructive notice, okay? Possession of information and knowledge that could have discovered by proper diligence. Dojo owner owes its invitees a duty to keep the premises in reasonably safe condition and warn invitees of dangers that may not be reasonably discovered. Remember though, the instructor is responsible for all knowledge that encompasses the dojo and its equipment. Now we'll talk about a coach's responsibility. In short, we talk about inspections of the facilities, standards for the appropriate facilities, preventative maintenance, and we talk about the shared responsibility doctrine. That involves everybody, instructors, assistant instructors, even involve parents. They all work together to fulfill their responsibilities to consistent with preventative maintenance and to prevent harm to everyone. Everyone's in on this. Present the necessary warnings for equipment and make sure your insurance reflects the status of your equipment. In other words, the coach must recognize and understand the hazards of all activities and facilities. Remove the unnecessary hazards from the facilities, modify the facilities, and programs to lessen the hazards that cannot be removed. Proper instruction, of course. The coach is responsible for teaching the physical skills of judo in a manner that will reduce the likelihood of injury. The instructor must know the proper mechanics and progressions in skill development and conditioning. Rules and regulations. If the coach or instructor fails to teach students the rules, and a student violates a rule that's directly responsible for an injury, the coach may be liable. So you must have some instrument to make sure that your students know the rules and regulations clearly. Okay, planning, class planning. Teaching skills in proper progression reduces injury from improper techniques. Written performance objectives have 3 parts: the task, the conditions upon the task, and the minimal level. There are 3 questions to consider in teaching an activity. 1, are the participants able to safely perform the activity? 2, what lead-up activities are necessary in order for the judoka to perform this task? And 3, what do you do about beginners or people that are unable to perform this particular task? Keep proper records. You got to keep proper records, and I don't have it on the slide. It's such a gimme, I forgot to put it on, but you should register your club with your national organization and your students, and make sure all your students and your club members are registrations uptight. That's ground one. I should have put it in this records document, but it's such common sense. I think everybody knows that. Injuries. So again, a judo coach must use due care. That's for the judo coach reasonable man standard to present an unreasonable risk to injury. You got to provide reasonable medical assistance and follow reasonable procedures to deal with injuries. Coaches have been held liable for their failure to know and use adequate first aid for heat stroke and for not knowing how to move players with suspected back or neck injuries. In the case of the injured athlete, the coach's duty becomes one of preventing further injury or further harm to that injured person. No judo student should ever be allowed to participate after a major injury until a doctor's release is obtained. Now we're going to talk about warnings. Okay, warning, I have a warning. Important information on warning follows. The goal of this presentation is to warn you of legal hazards when running a judo class. Beware. Waivers and releases, okay? We'll talk about that. I think your national organizations have boilerplate waivers that are pretty good. I've seen them. But a waiver, exculpatory or fault-free agreement between parties of majority age. Please remember, a waiver is not valid for minors, okay? The participant has to be warned of the risk of injury. In the event of a negligent act, an instructor cannot rely on waivers as a defense. But I would say waivers are recommended for warnings of inherent risk of injury. In fact, every waiver I've seen with judo, of course, has that. This is a menu for the plaintiff lawyer to get around the waiver or exculpatory clause. Warning, be careful of drafting your waivers and exculpatory clauses. The warnings have to be reasonable, clear, not contrary to law, not contrary to public policy, and done in good faith. A number of these points here have been litigated, which may negate some or all of a waiver agreement. So most waivers, actually in judo, there's an assumption of risk. All judo players before a person must sign a waiver assuming the risk. It's important to warn students of the risks inherent in practicing judo. This is in New York, and prior to this match, the instructor of the player being thrown by Travis Stevens was warned by a student of Travis's Osotogari. So I guess he was warned of the risk of getting dumped on his head or Osotogari by Travis Stevens, like a number of other people. Levels of comprehension, okay? This is important with the notice. There are 3 levels of comprehension. Make sure your students comprehend the 3 things about warnings of risk. Know the risk of judo practice and know the risk of judo competition. Understand the risks involved and what can happen, and the student has to appreciate the risk involved. And the knowledge, again, the perception depends upon the age of the student, how advanced or how beginner they are, but it has to be clear. Probably more notice is more important to a beginner, more extensive notice. Risk management. you're going to be careful of matchups, folks. This goes back to students and instructors knowing and complying with rules. Again, maintain a safe environment. And instructor, it's very important, instructor awareness of the differing skills of his or her students. I'm sure we all have had personal experiences with this issue in practice and in CI. So, considerations in your risk management program, we already went through them. The level of skill, level of experience, chronological age of the student, the height, the weight, and the maturity. Those are all considerations of risk management. Keep in mind all the time, of course. Here's some more. This is the summary of risk management program. The instructors, this is their duty too, by the way, to identify problem areas. Parents and students sign an agreement to participate. Parents should sign a consent and release form. Instructors provide written information on the potential injuries that can occur. Coaches must be closely screened and evaluated, and qualified coaches and instructors audit the programs. The reasonable person judo instructor should apply his or her reasonably good judgment to manage these risks. And the last slide is going to summary of the duties of the 11 coaches. Adequate supervision, provide a safe environment, proper instruction, proper planning, proper records, some skills as a judo instructor evaluating injuries and incapacity. You don't have to be a doctor, but to act reasonably. Adequate emergency procedures and first aid, adequate proper equipment, appropriate warnings and waivers, adequate matching with the students, and risk management. It was kind of fast, folks, but that's about all I have to say in this particular presentation. Rob, if you want to, do you have any questions or comments, or I'll open it up for that if anybody has any questions or comments. I think, Rob, you'd have to unmute. Let me see.
I unmuted all, but I can't unmute Rob. Oh, I did. He's unmuted. He's trying to come back in.
Okay, well, listen, I'm going to stop as an icebreaker here. If you could, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay. And
we can just.
Rob asked me this earlier, and I'm going to cover up. What about opening your dojo up to COVID? Now with COVID, is it a good idea to open up your dojo in this COVID epidemic? And I think it's a good review of what we just went over. First of all, I think notice. What about COVID? I think everyone would agree it could cause an injury, right? And everyone is on notice that it causes an injury. It's likely to cause an injury. So an average judo instructor would realize that it might cause somebody to get sick. And again, and then what's the coach's duty? To protect against unreasonable risks of injury. And then notice, like again, I think this is a kind of constructive notice. I don't know whether any states have a legal prohibition against COVID. I think it's all voluntary. And so it's up to the reasonable coach to decide whether they have reasonable protections for your students. If you do allow such a practice. And then assumption of harm. Can you write a waiver to students participating in COVID? I don't want to try. I don't want to try. You could try, and then a court will decide whether that's against public policy. To me, on its face, it looks like it might be against public policy. So you couldn't have a student waive agree to waive the COVID thing. And then you get into, did the practice call the COVID? It gets really complicated. So it's up to you instructors, you reasonable instructors using the reasonableness standard as to what you want to do. I have my personal opinion, but I keep that to myself. But that's it. Is everybody else unmuted, Rob? Any questions?
I do. I have a couple of students were asking me if they get sick with the virus, will the insurance of the organization cover it?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I meant to add that. That's it. First of all, when in doubt about your COVID, if you have your, and I'll answer your question. I meant to say this, Rob. If you're not sure whether you should open up your club to COVID or the danger of COVID, call your insurance company. Ask them whether they would cover any actions due to COVID. And I have a pretty good idea of what they'd say, but if that's it. So,
it doesn't state that in the USJA insurance, though.
I think, okay, that's right. Was it the real, so that's right. That's right. But you want to find out before instead of after you make a claim. You know, so maybe,
let me branch off of that. This is Marshall Kaufman in Dunkirk, Maryland. I'm with the COVID, everything shut down. I'm being asked by parents and others to do virtual instruction on the internet. This type of instruction winds up getting injured.
well, Marshall, that's a fact-based thing, how the injury happened, what they did, what the causation was, whether there was negligence. You couldn't inspect the place where how did the person get injured. All of those come into play. But I would imagine that it's the same standard as applies as people get injured in judo classes. I've seen a lot, you know, and so whether there was negligence on the part of instructor, in that negligence was a direct and proximate cause of that injury. And if it was not, or whether the student contributed to that injury by not maintaining the safety of their premises. But that's a vague answer, Marshall, but that's...
Well, let me add to that. When in the normal environment, I do not, so I could see a liability coming up where the question coming from the opposing attorney is, do you encourage your students to practice judo at home? And my answer is no. And then I can see the next response. And so then why did you do it on the internet?
Well, again, what are the four elements? It's a difficult question to answer, Marshall. And the injury, what was the cause of the injury? So no, but the student's a member of your club?
Yes.
Maybe if the student is registered, you have I would call your national organization about that if there's a legal action. That's the first person I would call. And then your own insurance person. If this person initiate legal action?
Yeah, I don't have an active case.
Oh, okay. So, well,
I'm just trying to prevent getting an act.
Again, it gets into foreseeability and all that. So, okay. Any other questions or comments?
Bill,
Mark?
I have a question here.
Yes, sir.
You said waivers are not valid for minors. What do you mean by that? We have parents sign for the minors. Do you mean
yeah, parents. but agreement to participate. Parents sign for the minors, okay? And the agreement participate, and there is some linkage there, but a minor alone cannot sign.
Okay.
Of course, they cannot sign it, yeah. But that's an agreement to participate, and there's language in that, but still, so that's what that is.
Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, I did. And under the guise of reasonableness and certain things with the dojo coming in, we're looking at things like checking everyone's temperature coming in, sanitizing the mats, having everyone wearing face masks. I mean, these to me, we used to put the guise of reasonableness and protection. These are reasonable things to do and probably would be recommended guidelines.
No, that makes, again, all of this is common sense, Mark.
I agree, but I'm
not
saying,
a judge. I would agree. You're acting reasonably. You're acting within the guidelines. You know, in those are guidelines, and the students are warned of that, and so as long as you're acting reasonably, and you know, it's hard to do judo sute geiko at a social distance.
oh, very true. Well, one of the things we're looking into is that, you know, we're wanting to recommend certain things like, you know, we're looking at infrared thermometers, so you don't have to, you know, or skin thermometer or something along that lines. And, you know, maybe just what type of disinfectants maybe. And also, you know, regular masks are not going to do too well in Rondori and also in Newaza. So we're kind of looking around for type of mask. One of the problems with some of the masks comes out, some masks protect for the air coming in, but do no protection for the air coming out. They have a relief valve. So if you sneeze, it's coming outside the mask, or you cough and it leaves the mask. Now it's in the air. So, I mean, do we want to make any recommendations or some general guidelines? Or, I mean, I know we say masks, but we ought to say some things about it. Like we're looking at masks maybe that wrap around and do a Velcro in the back that holds on better rather than just something that clips on the ears. So we're looking at reasonableness and trying to do things along that lines there. We're just trying to, okay, after reasonableness, what's effective, I guess. I'm done.
That's it. Follow the guidelines, and then this is new territory, Mark.
Yeah, for everyone, true. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. By the way, I'm with the Encino Judo Club out here in California.
Oh, beautiful area. You know, I'm a professional hand wringer, you know, very conservative, you know. I was trained to be that way, you know, so keep an eye on what your local authorities recommend. Good luck.
Back in the old days, we used to have none of these safety factors they used to have. Not these 8-inch thick floating mats that you throw on. Back in those days, you were on tatami or neoline. What do they call that mat?
Neoprene, yeah.
Neoprene. There was no such thing as soft or whatever. Now they got it to the point where a little thing will get them hurt. And that's why we don't have them throw them on their head anymore. Like we used to do back when I was a double leg takedown. They don't do that no more. No, don't do scissors anymore, you know. But this is going to be it's going to be painstaking for all of us because we have to baby steps and figure out exactly what we got to do in these training sessions for online or in the dojo. Most of the time, if you're in part of a what do they call it, community center, they're going to set all these things up for you, plus what you do in the dojo.
I mean, it helps to have a handbook of rules, distribute the handbook to the students, and review the handbook of what, so that, again, this gets into actual notice, real notice, actual notice, not constructive notice, and standards and rules. And then, more importantly, if you have a handbook, you're going to follow the handbook. You know, that's another very important element. I agree. I mean, the crash pads and all of that, but it's safety first. I mean, judo is expanded, and that's how the cookie falls. Takes ukemi.
They use these crash pads up until the time they can do flying throws or landing. That's just to get them to the point that they can do that without having to have that crash pad.
And that all goes back to the skill and knowledge of an average instructor. Now, a judo instructor, the average judo, they don't have to be a world champion judo instructor, but they have to have the skills to show the techniques and how to perform them safely at the average rate. That's the standard. And I'd like to recommend when you're on the mat instructing, always try to ensure there are 2 adults at the class, especially for specific supervision. Just in case something happens, you have 2 adults there that could see the situation. Now, I don't mean an adult and a minor. I don't mean anyone under 18 is not an adult. But that's my half a cent. And that's it.
Thank you.
Riley, you know you're muted. Let me see if I unmute everybody else. Well, I don't know.
Okay. Hey, any other questions? Otherwise, this has been an internet adventure. I've been off more than I've been on. We'll see how the video comes, and what I'll do is propose to Jim and Bill, if it's a bad video, we 3 will just get on Zoom on a good day, and we'll put Bill through it again, and we'll go ahead and post his video straight through, his presentation straight through. So we'll see. So if there is nothing else, we're going to call it a gruesome adventure in internet connectivity and a good session. Hopefully there was some information given, and that everyone appreciates what Bill has voluntarily contributed to us. Bill?
Yeah, and
last words?
Yeah, Rob Sensei, there's a link, there's the outline to this. He sent everyone the outline to this presentation. That might be a useful thing to have. I printed it out. It's not the PowerPoint, it's just 4 pages. And that's basically a review of what we covered today. So I hope everyone stays safe. Thank you for the opportunity to present this to you. I hope it's of some use. And please take care and stay safe.
Are we still going to have more sessions like this?
Yes. And we will be.
Yes.
Let me know. I'll be on them. I'll be there with you.
I hope this was useful. Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
What Jim has planned,
Okay, Rob's
what Jim has planned and what we have on the grill is Rick Salato going to do.
Rick Salato's going to do a coach
101. We have Jason Morris scheduled. We have several of his elite athletes.
Okay.
We have Jason Morris scheduled. We have Steve Cohen after his recent tragedy that he's scheduled. We have several other people.
Okay, well, thanks again, Rob.
We have a better notification system, see if we can do this better as we go.
Okay, I hope to see everybody again.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Jim Sensei. Thank you, Rob Sensei. Nice talking to you folks. Please take care.